Let me go ahead and get started. I'm obviously fresh from the 8:30 service and still dressed appropriately for that.
You want to stay warm.
I want to stay warm, yeah. We had a decent crowd at 8:30. I'm sorry that we've only got 5 or 6 people in the room, but that's all right. We've got a good number online. So, and the topic is very good. And as you all know, Vicki is a friend of this congregation and has really meant a lot to us. I want to thank her for being here, and just her depth of knowledge allows us to take a figure like Bonhoeffer much deeper than the way we inherit him in our culture and in the church, and that's always worth it, especially in these times. So I want to begin with a prayer and then turn it over to Vicki. So, dear God, we do give you thanks for the ability and the freedom to think and study and learn, and help that knowledge that we acquire in our head become part of our hearts and part of our faith and part of the way we live in the world. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen. Thank you, Vicki.
Thank you. Well, good morning, and good morning to the folks online. Let me ask the folks online that if for any reason the sound goes or you can't hear me, that you send a signal of some kind. I can see on my screen, so I hope that I'll pick that up if someone does that. Nice to be back here. In the fall, we did an extended look at Bonhoeffer's path through his own times. And Scott invited me back to talk specifically about this one essay called After 10 Years. He ordered books, but they're not here yet. But I think I'm going to come back in 2 weeks. And so hopefully Scott can be in touch with you about maybe picking them up in advance before the next class, or in 2 weeks you can pick them up. This is a really remarkable essay, and it's my favorite writing from Bonhoeffer. So I always like to talk about it. It's a very specific setting and background, and what he does in this letter is interesting. And one reason that Scott asked me to come talk about it is because Bonhoeffer is reflecting. This is December 1942. So he's reflecting on what has happened to Germany since the Nazis came to power. So after 10 years, the subtitle is an accounting or a reckoning. So he's really going through all the changes he has seen in German society, and his own deeper questions and his own theological understanding of what has happened to them, what they need to be thinking about, how they need to be thinking about their role as Christians and as citizens in a system like Nazi Germany. And so today I'm just going to sort of give an intro to the document itself, go into some background where, who's this letter for? When does he write it? What's the discussion? And talk a little bit about the perspectives that come out of the letter. Bonhoeffer's role in the resistance. Some of this we covered in the fall, but I'll repeat it in this context. And then look for a little bit at the different sections of the letter, because when you really look at what he does in terms of the outline, every section is just a couple of paragraphs. You begin to, it's an interesting turning point at a certain point. So who are the people in the room? In the Bonhoeffer biographies, they say that he shared this with key people in resistance. But in fact, he's sharing it with his family, and who are also key people in the resistance. So the only non-family member is the gentleman on the lower right-hand side, Major General Hans Oster, who was a close friend of Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, Hans von Dohnanyi. But let me talk a little bit about the family, because it's such a remarkable family. And 4 of them were, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, were executed by the Nazis. So this was a family that really, stood up against the Nazis and paid for it dearly. On the upper left-hand side is Hans von Dohnanyi, who was married to Bonhoeffer's sister, Christina. That is the cover of a book, because I really like the juxtaposition of the photos. But it's a book in German. I wish it were translated into English, because the subtitle of that book is A Marriage in Resistance. And Christine von Dohnanyi was just as active as her husband was also imprisoned. by the Nazis. So she really is part of the resistance, although she was not executed. In that middle photo, upper photo, is Bonhoeffer's brother Klaus Bonhoeffer and his wife Emmy Bonhoeffer. Emmy was a born Delbruck. They were neighbors of the Bonhoeffers. Her brothers are also in the resistance. So, the interconnections there, not just with the Bonhoeffer family, but other families, are very striking. Next to them is Bonhoeffer's sister Ursula and her husband Rudiger Schleicher, who was a lawyer for the German Air Ministry. Klaus Bonhoeffer was the head lawyer for Lufthansa. Hans von Dohnanyi was a very high-ranking member of the Justice Department. And that alone tells you that these are people who are not resisting from kind of outside the regime or even from the grassroots level, but these are people who are still members of the civil servants, still very much in the system. And so they're trying to resist from within, which raises a lot of interesting questions. And that's kind of an important background to know when you're reading after 10 years, because Bonhoeffer's writing about their struggles with their own conscience as members of this government and what they're trying to do. The lower row is Bonhoeffer's brother, Karl Friedrich. He's the only brother who was not involved in the resistance. I think I told you in the fall, he was a leading chemical physicist. Nominated 6 times for the Nobel Prize. So a leading figure in the scientific world in Nazi Germany. And they were constantly, the Nazi regime was constantly after him to get involved in their nuclear weapons project because he was one of the leading physicists in the world. So he's not in the resistance per se, but he's struggling with these issues. That middle lower figure is Eberhard Bethge, Bonhoeffer's friend, and seminarian and the post-war biographer. Bethge was by that time married to Bonhoeffer's niece, so he's in the room as well. And then Hans Oster, a major general, who as early as 1938 began talking to people about the possibility of overthrowing the Nazi regime. So these are the folks who are reading this document. The December 1942, which is when the family gathers between Christmas and New Year's, supposedly they read sections of the document every evening and discussed it. And so the German wartime situation in December of 1942 is that the Germans up to now have had, tremendous military success. They, marched into Eastern Europe, they marched into Western Europe. This is all the different countries where they've got a presence or that they're under German occupation in December 1942. In the summer of 1942, they went into Russia and got bogged down there, but they weren't yet defeated in December of that year. And one of the things that really frustrated Hans von Dohnanyi and General Oster was that the leading German generals, and these were the only people really who could get to Hitler to overthrow the coup, were reluctant to do so as long as Germany was winning the war. And so Bonhoeffer, there's a section in After 10 Years, for example, on success. And that's what Bonhoeffer is referring to, where he says, nothing succeeds like success. As long as someone's successful, people aren't going to turn against it. They're going to make their peace with it. And so they're wrestling with the political situation and the wartime situation as well. Of course, by February 1943, the tide turns. The siege of Stalingrad, the battles that the German army fought, I think it's still regarded as the largest number of military casualties in history because it goes from July through February. The German forces lost almost 1 million troops. And so after the Germans lose that battle and the Russian army begins slowly to advance, that's when the generals are willing to step in. And so you can see that March 1943, April 1943, May 1943, there's a sequence of planned assassinations of Hitler, none of which succeed. In one case, the bomb doesn't go off. In another case, Hitler doesn't show up. And so they quickly deactivate it. In another case, Hitler canceled again. So of the 3 people who were willing to make these attempts, 2 of them actually survive the Nazi era. Henning von Tresckow was involved in July 20th, and so he killed himself after that coup failed. In the middle of all that, April 1943, Bonhoeffer and his sister Christina and her brother and her husband Hans von Donani are arrested and imprisoned. Christina von Donani is released after several weeks, but Bonhoeffer and Hans von Donani were imprisoned from that time until the end. So they're not there, they're not out active for the July 1944 attempt, which is the final coup attempt that fails and collapses, and that's, that, and in the wake of that, the German, the Nazi government arrests thousands of people, executes thousands of people. That's when things begin to unravel for Bonhoeffer and his family in prison. But up to that point, this was still in the works, even though Bonhoeffer was in prison. So briefly, what Donani was doing and what Bonhoeffer was doing, and Donani is really one of the leaders of the move toward this coup. He's a high-ranking lawyer in the Justice Ministry. He intentionally stays in to see what he can do from within the system. So he's part of conversations very early on with military leaders and civil servants, and notably General Oster, about overthrowing the government. And there are various discussions of this, and some of them don't go anywhere, and then the war comes. And so it's that kind of situation, but he's also really coordinating the immediate aftermath, because Donani says, and he was right, I think, if we overthrow the government, we have to have something in place to step in. We can't just sort of leave the field open for, Nazis to sort of try to push back or whatever. And so Bonhoeffer, that was part of Bonhoeffer's role in the resistance, was that he first traveled internationally to church leaders to let them know that this was in the works, and asking them to talk with their governments, sending that signal. He was carrying peace feelers. He also traveled throughout Germany to different grassroots resistance groups to talk about what happens afterwards. Some of these groups are really planning very concretely what the post-Nazi government's going to be. I mean, there was going to be an education department, an economic department, a state department, a diplomacy. I mean, they were lining people up to step into these roles after July 20th. He also plays an important pastoral role, I would say, in thinking through all these issues, not just the logistics, but the deeper ethical issues with his family. And that's what this document is about. And so throughout this period, he's writing and thinking about, what's happened in Germany, on citizens' responsibility, on guilt, and, an exploration of his own personal faith and his vision for the future. And there's a turning point that I'll get to in a minute in the middle of this essay, where you can sort of see him shift from, first is the assessment of what's happened in Germany, and then he begins to talk about what faith has to say to this. And that's where his own faith begins to come into expression. But there's some other interesting Bonhoeffer texts from this period. And one thing to remember when you read this essay is this is before the prison letters. This is while he's still he's not yet in prison. And so this is a very different perspective from what he begins to write in the letters and papers from prison, which is another thing that makes it so interesting. So he's continuing besides this to write think pieces on church-state relations, on democracy, that he's sharing with colleagues abroad, but also sharing with other people in the resistance. He writes a wonderful little essay about what does it mean to tell the truth, in a situation, in a circumstances of Nazi Germany where you have a government that is continually lying to the people. And he writes this actually in prison. And it's part of his own response to having to lie in interrogations, where he says, so, if I lie, I'm betraying somebody, or if I tell the truth, I'm betraying somebody. But what does that mean when I say I'm intentionally lying to save somebody? So he thinks through that. He drafts a church announcement for after the coup. He drafts a proposal for the reorganization of the German Protestant Church after the coup. And he has a lot of thoughts about, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, how the European churches are going to establish civil society and reestablish ties to Germany. So he's reflecting not so much in this essay on his work for the resistance, but I would say theologically and personally, first as a native of this country that has gone off the rails, but also as a theologian and a member of his church who by that time is bitterly disappointed in the failures of his church to stand up against the Nazis. But he's also reflecting, and this comes toward the end of the essay, on the future. What kind of foundation are they laying for the younger generations? And what are their obligations to the coming generations? And in December 1942, he doesn't know what the future is. I mean, there's no way that he could have foreseen the failure of the coup or the defeat of Nazi Germany. For all he knows, this is going to go on for decades to come. And so he's thinking actively. And he also, you can see this in his letter, in his book on discipleship, and especially his little book on Life Together, which he writes in the mid-1930s for seminarians. He's training them, he's educating them to be ministers in a totalitarian state, and trying to say to them spiritually, how they need to keep going, what they will need to do that, and how they should think about their faith in that context. So these are subtexts in After 10 Years as well. So these are the sections of After 10 Years. Like I said, each one is a couple paragraphs. And you can see just from the themes, and that's why I sort of typed them up. He starts out by saying, has there ever been a people in history with so little ground beneath their feet? He talks about how their world has been turned upside down since 1933. Then he goes on to a section called Who Stands Firm, where he says, all of the things we were taught about how to be a good citizen, how to be a good leader, what our obligations to the state are, none of these things are working. And this is a fascinating section because he goes through things that we would think of as virtues, conscience, responsibility, a sense of duty, and he sort of tears each one apart. There's a wonderful quote. So the beginning of the Who Stands Firm says, "The great masquerade of evil has thrown all ethical concepts into confusion." And then he talks about the man of duty who ultimately will have to do his duty to the devil if he continues following that course. So he's really looking at their role in Nazi Germany and how this has upended, what they were taught about what it means to be a good citizen. He then goes on to ask, why is there no civil courage? He's looking around him, and so he thinks about that. He looks at this issue of success. One of the most famous sections, that if you're on social media at all or Facebook, you may have seen this, on stupidity. I think this is the most frequently quoted part, but he's not talking about stupidity as an intellectual issue or people aren't bright enough. He's talking about the process by which Germans allowed themselves to be made stupid. That is, they decided there were certain things they weren't going to see, or certain things they weren't going to know, or certain things they weren't going to talk about. And it's often, one of the things that has really struck me when I talk about this and when I look on social media, it sounds snarky. And we're a society right now that is sort of extremely snarky. So on stupidity, yes, we know who the stupid people are, but it's followed immediately in this essay by a warning against feeling contempt for others. And that's where you begin to see his turn toward the theological. That section on contempt, he talks about how they're tempted to feel contempt for the Nazis, for their enemies. And then he says, but nothing of what we despise in another is itself foreign to us. We must learn to regard human beings less in terms of what they do and neglect to do, and more in terms of what they suffer. And so he's arguing here for a deeper look at the humanity of even the worst Nazis, and trying to see it from that perspective. And it's kind of a remarkable turning point that then gets into the section on imminent justice, where he says, God ultimately is going to judge these people, but also us. What does that mean? Some statements of faith on God's action in history, which I'll get to in just a minute, but let me go through this list first. Then he's already turning now to the pep talk, I would say, or the theological pep talk. to his audience, where he's saying, so, what does it mean to trust people? What are we thinking when we talk about a sense of quality? Look at how degenerate our society has become, how hateful, and yet, where do we find quality in relationships, but also in cultural quality? In Nazi Germany, of course, Hitler, banned all kinds of paintings and novels and pieces of music that he called degenerate art. So the Nazis had a very specific kind of art form and architecture and literature that they were promoting, which was, of course, really dreadful. I mean, it was propaganda designed to create hate. And some of the greatest German artists and writers fled because of it. And so, Bonhoeffer's arguing for, the return, or to keep an awareness of what's really lasting and good in a culture, as opposed to what, the government is using for propaganda. He writes about suffering. He thinks about present and future. He writes about optimism, peril and death, and then this moving section where he says, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We've been worn down. Are we still of any use? And then he gets to the very end of the essay, The View from Below, where he concludes, it remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below. And he's talking here to people who are the German elite. They didn't grow up understanding that concept, but he's saying we've learned through our experience now that we see it from the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled, in short, from the perspective of the suffering. If only during this time bitterness and envy have not corroded the heart, that we come to see matters great and small, happiness and misfortune, strength and weakness with new eyes. So that's, where he ends up. And it's, as I said, it's my favorite piece from Bonhoeffer. But it's also moving to me that he so succinctly goes through the failures of what happened to Germany under the Nazis, and then goes on with this vision of the future. And one of the things that he says in this latter part concerns their obligation to future generations, where he said, it doesn't matter that we come out of this looking like heroes, we're not going to, but we're laying a foundation that future Germans can live from. And that I think is really impressive. So this is the section of some statements of faith on God's action in history. And this is, for me, sort of the key, the center of this. And I've even seen it used in German churches as a prayer in and of itself, or a reading. So I'm not going to read it for you. You can read it as I talk about it. But simply this, it's the turning point in the essay where he says, and he's saying this to, members of his family who are not really theologically inclined, not regular churchgoers, but they're looking for guidance. They looked to Dietrich Bonhoeffer for some guidance. And so he is expressing here this optimism that no matter what happens, God can let good emerge from this. He needs human beings who let everything work out for the best. That is, we know there's only so much within our power. So we have to trust in God for the rest. That God will give people the strength to resist, but you don't get it the first day. That is, you have to be working along in this process of resistance. As you go down that path, you will begin to discover new strengths within yourself. And then this wonderful statement, I believe that even our mistakes and shortcomings are not in vain, and it's no more difficult for God to deal with them than our supposedly good deeds. And I just love that sentence where, you think you're doing something good, and then you are hard on yourself for the things that you fail in, and you realize that, on some level for God, those things are equal, that God loves us as we are, with both our sins and our good qualities. And then this closing statement, I believe that God is no timeless fate, but waits for and responds to sincere prayer and responsible actions. So prayer and action is what he's suggesting here. So the reason Scott asked me to talk about this was he thought it would be really interesting for us today to think about what would we say if we were writing a letter like this, thinking back over past years, thinking back where we are today as a society. And Bonhoeffer's letter, like I said, his subtitle is an accounting. And he's writing this in an accounting as a citizen of Germany, but also very much so as a Christian. And so it's an interesting thing to think about. And I've thought about it when I was working on the introduction to this book. If I were to sit down with my kids and talk about the world from which I came, which they grew up in a completely different time. What values would I talk about? What things would I emphasize to them? What things would I want to give to them, to prepare them for whatever the future holds? So in a way, it's something that one can do anytime. But of course, in our current situation, I think it's also worth thinking about in terms of what Bonhoeffer writes about. So, what would you write to your family or your children or your friends about where we are right now? How do you think we got here? What things would you really notice in terms of how we got here as a society, and how we got here as a people of faith? And what would you suggest to them? On the right-hand side, in terms of the more Christian side of it, Karl Barth's wonderful quote, holding the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. That is, you're aware of both worlds. How helpful is that? At some point, do you need to decide to be engaged in response to things in the newspaper, or is it constantly this back and forth where you really need to read the Bible and pray regularly to sort of keep that compass steering you in the right direction? Or are there other practices that are useful? So that's where I'm going to stop. I don't know if you have questions or observations. And as I said, Scott's idea was that this is something you can work on at home if you so desire. You can discuss it with others. You don't have to. But just thinking in terms of that sort of action that Bonhoeffer took with his family, because he wrote many books. We've got his letters and papers from prison. There's certain things we focus on, but this is a much more intimate and personal reflection from him that I think is probably the most personal one that we have. And that's one of the reasons I really like it so much. So, questions, ideas, responses? Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by these resistors who were working for the German government.
Yeah.
Because it's not like they were teaching math.
Right.
If you were a lawyer for the Justice Department, you were part of the dictatorship.
Right.
If you were a lawyer for the Tanza, you were part of the war.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, and my understanding is you could quit a job like that now to Germany and not be punished or anything. You didn't have to.
Yeah.
So what was going on in the minds of these people?
Yeah. For the people at home, I don't know if you heard that, but the question is, and this is something that I've really thought about a lot, and I write about it in the introduction to this book, that Bonhoeffer's, brothers-in-law and brothers are working they're in the Nazi government, and they have high positions, and they stay in the government throughout the 1930s, and they're turning against it. So they are part of the system that is creating this evil, and how do they wrestle with that? The most material we have on that is from Hans von Dohnanyi. He's a really interesting figure. In this book that I mentioned, which I would love to see in English, goes into that. So he decides early on, he's, at that point, he's a lower level lawyer, but he's going to stay in the Justice Department. He begins to keep track of things he sees that are wrong, and he's making a list. And in 1933, Dohnanyi thought, maybe this will be over by 1934. Then we're going to put Hitler on trial, and here's the list of things they did. I can tell you exactly what they did. So he starts out that way. By 1935, when it's a dictatorship, Hitler clearly has a hold on Germany. This regime is not going to go anywhere soon. Dohnanyi really wrestles with that, and in this book that I mentioned, there are letters to his wife where he just is in anguish about what's happening, and saying, I really envy people who can go home at night from work and they can sleep well. I can't. So he's he's clearly wrestling with this all the way through. And yet he stays in. And this is the intriguing thing when you look at the Nazi bureaucracy, because there are people throughout that bureaucracy who stayed in, and especially in terms of the churches, church figures sort of had people they felt they could talk to. One of them, ironically, was Heinrich Himmler. Well, yeah, I mean, so there, you're making your bargain with the devil. And at what point do you sort of, I mean, this is why Bonhoeffer writes, and after 10 years, we have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. Are we still of any use? I mean, he's looking at that dilemma head on. And the same is true of all these other people who are, in high-ranking positions. They're, anti-Nazi. I mean, within the Bonhoeffer family, you can really see that in the correspondence. Others turn against it kind of late. Henning von Tresckow is one of the generals who was one of the ones who, was planning a suicide mission against Hitler. Tresckow was with one of the units in Eastern Poland that committed mass atrocities, and that was enough to turn him against the regime, where he said, what we're doing now is just wrong. And so there are people who step out, who get involved in the resistance in 1943-44, and there are people who are there from the beginning. But I think it's an important thing to be aware of when we're reading after 10 years, because it's one reason that Bonhoeffer goes through this list of civil courage, stupidity, I mean, where he's, he goes through all these elements, all the rationales that people have for working for the regime and saying, maybe this doesn't hold up, but yeah. I mean, so I think it's a really important part of this essay.
Am I right that would it have been possible in Nazi Germany just to quit your job and not be harassed?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it depends on where you were. Depends on
the army, you couldn't just quit. But if you were civilian.
In the 1930s, I mean, there were people who left. There were people who left Germany. There were people who stayed in and kind of rationalized what they did. And there's a lot of literature when you look at each of these cases. I mean, how they wrestle with that. But yeah, and at the same time, it's interesting because there were in the justice system, for example, there was the civil service that existed before 1933 was still in place. I mean, that's Donati is part of that system. Well, all the brothers are before 1933. And so you have colleagues who think the way you do, and you say, okay, we're gonna stay here, but we're gonna try to do something about this. And especially within the justice system, there's a Jewish lawyer named Ernst Frankel, who's a fascinating figure. He's the one who came up with the notion of the dual state. I don't know if anyone's ever heard that. So what Frankel said was that Nazi Germany in the early 1930s was you had the Nazi system of government, and you still had this parallel state of old civil servants who were still trying to do something. And Ernst Frankel won cases on behalf of German Jews as late as 1937. So he left after that. He came to this country, but he was still within that system trying to do something because he felt that if you got the right judge, you could get a fair trial. So it took a while for that to disintegrate, and I think that was one of the issues. Other questions? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, did any of the material that Donati kept after the war result in prosecution?
No, because so he was keeping a record of the crimes. At some point in the early years of the war, they buried these documents because they were worried about their discovery and what it would mean for the prosecution. And once Donati and Bonhoeffer were arrested, they were initially the Nazis didn't initially think they were part of a coup. After the July 20th attempt in 1944, that's when the Gestapo is set loose and just cracks everything down. And that's when somebody betrays the presence of these documents and they find them. So Bonhoeffer the Nazis didn't realize that Bonhoeffer and Donati had a connection to this until September of 1944, after the coup, because they found the documents. And at that point, Bonhoeffer, who had been in prison in Tegel, was moved to the Gestapo prison. Hans von Donati was moved to Sachsenhausen. That was when Klaus Bonhoeffer and Rüdiger Schleicher were arrested. So the dominoes began to fall after the coup attempt, when the Nazis really began to track that down. Other questions?
Quick question, why
Yeah.
was Bonhoeffer arrested?
I'm sorry?
Why was Bonhoeffer arrested?
He was arrested on 4 counts. One was money laundering. Well, no, this is kind of interesting, because this is related to the rescue attempt of getting 14 Jews from Germany to Switzerland. And they secretly carried money into Switzerland, or transferred funds into Switzerland to get the visas and the support. And then they had different people who helped them get across the border. And that came out of Donati's office. And Donati also was keeping money for the Confessing Church at that point. And so the Gestapo was sort of following that money trail and thinking, this was, that they were, guilty of currency violations. Bonhoeffer was also arrested because he had helped other Confessing Church pastors escape the draft. And there were 2 other reasons and they sort of tagged on, he speaks out for the Jews. I mean, that was in there too. But they initially didn't realize the connection to the coup.
Vicki, what was the date of the Stalingrad battle when it turned militarily?
Well, it was January, February of 1943. It was the Russian winter.
43.
I'm sorry, 43. The Russian winter. The German army got bogged down. Hitler poured troops into the east, and even as they were losing, he kept sending more German troops over there because he felt they were needed to defeat the Russians. And I mean, the Russian casualties, civilian and military, were just horrible. But the German army they didn't win. They had to retreat finally.
Were these 4 assassination attempts from the same resistance movement? Were they coordinated? Were they independent?
So the ones that immediately followed, so the ones in early 1943 were known in the Bonhoeffer family. That inner circle, Donati and Oster, and Oster particularly because he had been tracking the military issues and trying to reach out to military officers from the very beginning. Hans Oster is the major general who secretly sent advance warning of the German invasion of Belgium and the Netherlands to those embassies. So he was already, guilty of treason, if you will, but he was already and he was trying to move the generals to act. And so he was tracking those attempts. Yeah.
Did they ever arrest Oster?
Yeah, Oster was arrested after July 20th and executed. Yeah.
It seems something of a miracle that we've got as many papers as we do. And I keep thinking about the prison guard who smuggled the letters out. Did he get caught?
No. And there's nothing really known about his fate. I mean, Bonhoeffer was moved out of Tegel in September. And at that point, I mean, and Bonhoeffer, the guard was actually planning to help Bonhoeffer escape from Tegel in September. And then after his brother Klaus was arrested, Bonhoeffer decided not to do that because he knew that would have repercussions for the family. But so after 10 years was shared with the family and was kept supposedly in the Bonhoeffer family attic and then buried in their backyard during the bombing of Berlin. So that's how that document has been preserved. But all of the other documentation, there are various, it is interesting because I've edited the complete works and it's 17 volumes. So there's a lot of stuff there that, a lot of paperwork that was preserved. But the prison letters, were smuggled out by this guard. And then the family kept a few after that, but there weren't as many to keep.
Do you have a sense that those 4 assassination attempts I guess my question is it a surprise that none of them worked? As close as that, I mean, they seem to really get close.
Well, yeah, these were, I mean, if I go back to the circumstances, yeah, I mean, you know, in one, I mean, in all of them, they're not discovered because, you know, the bomb doesn't go off and he disables it and they, yeah, so it's, you know, Hitler seems to lead a charmed life during this period. And after July 20th, in July 20th, you know, 4 people were killed, and several were injured. And, you know, Hitler was only slightly injured. And at that point, Hitler said, this is a miracle. You know, God has chosen me to be leader. I mean, he really sort of saw it as sort of a divine providence that he kept escaping, because there were other assassination attempts earlier from civilians. I mean, there are a couple of, I don't remember the total number of attempts on Hitler's life, but there were others. But these were the ones related to the plot.
Is there a sense, or do you have a sense of what would have happened had they had one of them succeeded?
So that's the question. Like I said, they had, you know, by early 1943, they have this plan in place, and they've got leading political figures and leading, you know, economists and what have you, who know about it and who are willing to step in. The other major circle is the so-called Kreisau Circle, and that is, I don't know if people are, you know, you may have seen books about this. So there's this Oster conspiracy, which is with Hans von Donati. The Kreisau Circle were also political figures, some military figures, Adam von Trott, Count von Moltke. So they were also planning to be part of that. And they were putting they were more responsible for putting the structure in place for a governance system. And what Bonhoeffer did was take word to the Vatican and to, you know, his friends in England, trying to persuade the Allied governments to be prepared to negotiate with the generals. That was what the generals wanted. Was, you know, they're carrying these peace favors. They're saying, we're going to do this. These generals want to negotiate with you afterward, but we need a signal from you of your support. And both Churchill and Roosevelt at a certain point decided, nope, you know, you get rid of them first and then we'll talk. And part of the reason for that was that the generals, you know, wanted to still keep some of the territory that they had won. So they wanted to keep Poland. They wanted to keep Austria. You know, when you look at the resistance as a whole, you understand Donati's frustration, not just at the inaction of the generals, where as long as the war is going fine, they're thinking, okay, we can do this. But once the generals turn against him, you know, they still want a certain deal. And Roosevelt and Churchill say, you know, we're not making any deals with you. We want to see what happens first. And so that's, I mean, it's something that is debated in Bonhoeffer circles. It's not really debated among historians. I mean, I think it was the right call, but there's a certain poignancy that Bonhoeffer is carrying these messages. And there's even a visit to Karl Barth, where in Switzerland in the early 1940s, where Barth says, you know, what do you think you're doing? What do you think is going to happen? I mean, Barth is sort of the voice of reality, and Bonhoeffer says, no, these people are sincere, they're going to do this. I mean, it's sort of interesting in that larger context, perhaps, you know, to see Bonhoeffer as somewhat naive about the political realities, but absolutely dedicated to, you know, the overthrow of the regime and the reconstruction of Germany. Also, from Bonhoeffer's perspective, on a moral basis, and that's why he spends a lot of time thinking about, you know, what the church should be like after something like this happens. You know, what the path forward is, and that work actually was carried on by Eberhard Bethge, and several of the members who had studied, several of the seminarians who had studied with Bonhoeffer who survived the war. There was a group called the Unterwegs Circle, the On the Road Circle, after 1945 that kept meeting until the 1950s. And they wanted a different kind of church, I mean, based on what had happened in the church struggle and in the German Protestantism and in the Nazi regime. And it kind of fizzled out because the church, immediately institutionally reconstituted itself in 1945. So this was a faction within the church. Where it did take root was in East Germany, because the leader in East Germany was a man named Albrecht Schönherr, who had studied with Bonhoeffer, and he took Bonhoeffer's model of church because he was in a socialist state that was in which there was no official church. And so he said, okay, so we're going to do this model of church from below that Bonhoeffer was talking about. And so that's a fascinating story to look at the decades of how he tries to do that.
So I understand that's from the church perspective, but you said historians don't really speculate about, I mean,
No,
who would
there's-
have succeeded over, we watch assassination attempts often.
And that's why this attempt was so impressive, that they really wanted, they were picking top people in the regime and people who were still in the regime who said, we'll be part of this. You do this, we're on board with it. And so you've got a certain amount of stability in governments. If you've got people at the top, so Oster had a list of 38 leading Nazis that were to be assassinated. It wasn't just Hitler. It was the upper ranks. Goering, Goebbels, he said, these people, you can't let them survive this. But the next level on down, and there were people that they knew there who said, sure, you get rid of these clowns, we'll do this. But as you mentioned, these are all people who are complicit. I mean, it's a really complicated issue when you get into the weeds of that.
Well, you talked about the possibility that these people were naive. And I just wonder, I don't know very much about it. I mean, were they naive, or did they want to have their cake and eat it too? Like they wanted to get rid of Hitler, but they still wanted to run Germany and keep Poland and things like that.
Yeah, so those are the generals who
Well, the generals. Yeah.
right. The civil servants, I would say it's, you have to kind of look at each individual case. But it is a very complicated issue. And there's a way in which Bonhoeffer, I think, is out of his depth. In the political realities of that, he's writing from a faith perspective, where he says, we have to restore the soul of this country, and how are we going to do that, and what kind of moral foundation are we leaving for coming generations? And so it's really fascinating. I think it's why it's so important to read, to see him in conjunction with these other family members, especially Donani. There's a wonderful little book that I think I recommended in the fall by Elizabeth Sifton and Fitz Stern, called No Ordinary Men. And it's about Donani and Bonhoeffer. So the two of them together, and juxtaposing those issues. The other really interesting book, if you're into this kind of thing, is one that came out in the 1990s by Clemens von Klemperer, called The German Resistance Against Hitler, The Search for Allies Abroad. His name is, I don't know if I can type this up, it shows on the screen. Clemens von Klemperer, he was, let me see if I can do this. I could actually do it within the PowerPoint. You just figure out. So I'm looking to see how I can type something in. Ah, yes, okay. He was a Jewish refugee from Austria. And the other reason he's interesting is that he wrote about Bonhoeffer. He was fascinated by the figure of Bonhoeffer. And so if you look up his name, on Amazon or something, you'll come up with several essays by him. But this book really goes into the full complexity of all this. And so it's a great book.
I'm stunned thinking about our own culture.
Yeah.
I'm stunned by some of the same things that we see here. I mean, I'm not comparing us to Nazis yet. But I think I'm really fascinated by, we have to look at other people's humanity.
Yeah, yeah.
And if I'm thinking about how do we go forward, I think we have to start with the idea that a huge swath of the American public felt like the government that was in place was not meeting their need.
Hmm.
And they made what I think is a bad choice, but I think we need to understand why they felt like they had to make that choice. And I
Yeah.
think that's a really hard thing for a lot of us to do. It's a lot easier to say, basket of deplorables or,
Right.
other things like that.
Well, that's something to think about, if you want to think about it over the next 2 weeks, and bring into the conversation on February 15th. Because these are the kinds of things that I think Bonhoeffer is trying to get at, where he's trying to understand what has happened. Other questions or comments?
I also think it's really good for me as somebody who is still involved in federal government and how to have what I do still makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and that's where Donani is very, his situation, that's kind of where he was, and a number, I think that Klaus Bonhoeffer, all of them, but Donani's the one that we know the most about and who's been written about the most, because he was struggling with that from the very beginning.
Yeah, it's sort of amazing to me that he was given paper and things to write with when he was in prison. How did that happen?
So Bonhoeffer, this was until he was in Tegel, or until he left Tegel. So during the prison letters are from that period, because he's got a privileged position, and I didn't even get into this, but one of his relatives who was involved in July 20th was the city commandant of Berlin, Paul von Hase, who was a cousin of Bonhoeffer's mother. Paul von Hase was only joined the conspiracy about 2 weeks before July 20th. So he was the top guy in Berlin. And he saw to it that Bonhoeffer was treated well in Tegel. And Bonhoeffer was horribly embarrassed about it because he knew, Paul von Hase was a leading Nazi at that point. Paul von Hase, then agrees to be part of the conspiracy and seals off the streets after the coup attempt. That's what they want him to do. And then he's arrested and executed. So there are people like that are, so anyway, back to your original question, that's how Bonhoeffer was able to, have a privileged cell and, have visitors and write letters. After that, there's some communication, but very little, and some visits of the family, but that's when the communication really begins to break down. Other questions? I know you've got church in a couple minutes, 5 minutes.
I've been trying to read some of Bonhoeffer. I find it difficult.
Yes, yes.
He's not an easy read.
He's not an easy read. This
But
is
some
one
of
of, this
the-
is one of the more
the-
accessible texts.
But the point I wanted to make was that he, in the part that I've been reading, this is in Ethics,
Okay.
he's talking about how we really should spend our lives trying to do God's will. And the problem that I see with that is, how do we know what God's will is? And I think he must have struggled with
Yeah,
that too.
yeah.
Do you see that in?
Yes, that's it. And that is where he ultimately ends up. And even in this essay, when you read it, there are sections where he talks about, the only person who can really stand up is the person who follows God faithfully. Bonhoeffer believed theologically that if you pray, if you rely on God, that the way will open to you to follow God, and that's what he meant by discipleship. And to accept responsibility for your mistakes. He allowed for the fact that you may be doing the wrong thing, and you have to answer for that. But that's how he saw it. He wasn't. His theology is not one of principles and commandments you simply have to obey. It really is something deeper than that. And that's one of the things that makes him, and Ethics is a tough read. But all of his books are tough. But this book, and actually there are sections of this that he puts into Ethics because he was working on this material at the same time. But this book is one of the more readable, things that he wrote.
Well, if laws aren't there to guide us, what in the world would tell us what God's will is?
Well, and what he says is in Nazi Germany, they were in a situation where the laws were wrong. And he said, and Germans all of these folks were raised to obey the law, to, fulfill their civic duty, and this is one of the tragedies of German culture after 1933, is that people thought, no matter what, this is what I'm supposed to do. And so Bonhoeffer writes here, and he writes in Ethics. So what do you do when the laws are utterly wrong and your whole society has been turned upside down? When all of a sudden the right thing to do is to murder children with disabilities, which is what the Nazis were doing. That was a German law.
That's German law versus God's law.
Exactly.
So
So Bonhoeffer says you have to have a sense of clarity that when things are that wrong, that you know what the right thing to do is, and the right thing doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily in the Bible, but it's even deeper than that.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I hope to see you in 2 weeks. I hope that, Scott will be in touch about whether you can pick up the book or not. But if this is something you want to think about in the coming 2 weeks, because in the 2 weeks I was planning to sort of have a session on how we would write such a letter today. And if you have additional questions at that point about any of this, we can talk about that too.
What is the cost of the book?
I don't know how much Scott got them for, and I don't know if this is a freebie or not.
Okay.
But he was taking care of the book order, so.
Oh,
I know it's half price right now on Amazon, because I looked when I was looking for it for him, but,
Can we get a copy of those questions?
Yes, yeah, I'll give this to Scott so that Scott can send around the PowerPoint to people who are home, and also the,